Mystery, suspense, and murder. The truth about the Orient Express. What if you were trapped on a haunted train, with no way to escape the darkness closing in? Would you survive the terror, or become a part of its never-ending nightmare? The train rattled steadily through the night, its rhythmic hum vibrating beneath the floor. Outside, the blackness swallowed everything. Snow drifted in thick curtains, wrapping the world in a blanket of white silence. Inside, the passengers shifted, uneasy in the confined space. The dim light flickered as if unsure of its own existence. The air was stale, filled with the faint scent of old leather and tobacco. A figure sat by the window, staring out into the nothingness. His face was pale, as if the cold had seeped into his very bones. The others around him seemed oblivious, lost in their own thoughts. A sudden jolt shook the carriage, a brief interruption in the monotony. A gasp from the back. The figure turned his head sharply. A shadow darted across the aisle, swift and subtle. He wasn't sure if it was real or just a trick of the mind. The silence deepened again, but now it felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. The figure looked to his left, then right. No one was watching. His hands trembled ever so slightly. A creak echoed from the other end of the carriage. He tried to focus on the sound, but it was too faint, too fleeting. The train lurched again, and this time it felt wrong. The lights flickered once more, then went out. Darkness. A collective intake of breath rippled through the compartment. His heart raced as his eyes adjusted to the black void around him. The only sound was the steady click of the train's wheels, louder now. Then, the unmistakable scent of iron reached his nose. Warm. Metallic. He froze. A slow, deliberate breath. He reached out. The sudden touch of something soft against his fingers made him recoil. It was something wrong. His hand recoiled, but the sensation stayed. Cold, wet, like skin. A sound, a low groan, echoed from the farthest corner. Another figure emerged, but it wasn't human. The stench of death lingered, suffocating. And in the darkness, he finally understood. Something had happened. Something terrible. And he was alone in the middle of it. His pulse thundered in his ears. The air felt suffocating, thick with something ancient and wrong. The shadow moved closer, its form barely visible in the dim glow of a single, failing bulb. He took a step back, but the train shifted, trapping him in place. He could hear the faint rustle of fabric. Someone else was nearby. He turned quickly, eyes darting, but saw nothing. His breath was ragged now, his chest tight with panic. The faint groan came again, and he couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely. The weight of the silence was crushing, pressing down on him from all sides. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers grazing the cool metal of a small object. A lighter. His thumb pressed down on the wheel, but no flame came. Frustration clawed at him as he tried again, his hands slick with sweat. Then, just as quickly, the lights flickered back to life. The train seemed to sigh, the clattering of its wheels resuming as if nothing had happened. But it was different now. The air was thicker, heavier with something that didn't belong. He looked around the compartment, but no one seemed to notice. Faces were turned, some lost in conversation, others staring into empty space. He swallowed hard, the taste of fear rising in his throat. A low chuckle echoed from the far side of the car. Not the kind of laughter that belonged in this place. It was a sound that sent shivers down his spine. A face appeared in the doorway, pale and gaunt, eyes hollow. It was staring directly at him. Not a word was spoken, but the message was clear. Danger was near. And it was watching. Waiting. He turned his back, walking quickly to the next compartment. His heart raced, each step an echo of his growing dread. But the figure was still there, lurking just at the edge of his vision. He pressed his back against the cold metal of the door. A sharp noise, the scraping of nails on steel, sent him spinning around. There was no one. No one but the darkness. It was closing in. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. The room felt smaller now. The walls were closing in. He yanked his arm free, slipping in the blood, but the grip remained. Not on his body. On his soul. He stepped back, eyes wide. The body. It wasn't still anymore. Its eyes twitched. A slow, unnatural movement. He froze. The body's mouth opened, lips curling into a twisted smile. The smile grew wider, stretching unnaturally. It wasn't a smile. It was a grimace. A silent scream. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The air grew colder, biting through his clothes. And then, the whisper again, this time louder. Help me! It wasn't a request. It was a command. The voice was raw, ragged. As if it had come from the depths of despair. His legs shook, his mind screaming at him to run. But his feet refused to move. The body on the floor jerked, convulsed. Then stilled. The room was silent once more. Except for the soft rustle in the air. Something else was in the car. A shift in the shadows. He could feel it, like an invisible presence, watching him from every corner. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, dimming, then flaring back to life. And the figure was there. Right in front of him. A face pale as death, eyes wide and hollow, staring straight into his. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its eyes, empty, soulless, said it all. The figure's lips barely moved, but the words were clear. Run! The voice was chilling. Hollow. Like it came from a place beyond time, beyond space. He turned, the words echoing in his mind, his body finally responding. Run! He stumbled back, his hands scraping against the walls as he searched for the exit. The train seemed to shift beneath him, groaning, its movements unnerving. The figure stepped closer, a hand reaching out. He moved faster now, heart racing, feet pounding on the cold metal. And just as he reached the door, the lights went out. Complete darkness. A breathless gasp. And then nothing. His skin prickled with the cold, the darkness swallowing him whole. He stumbled forward, blindly reaching for the door handle, his fingers trembling. The train lurched again, throwing him off balance. His back hit the cold metal wall with a sharp thud. A low, guttural noise came from behind him, almost like a growl. He whipped around, but there was nothing. Just the blackness. The oppressive, suffocating blackness. He couldn't tell if his eyes were closed or if the darkness was that complete. The sound of his breath was the only thing he could hear now. Short, shallow gasps. Then a scrape. Barely perceptible, but there. A movement in the dark. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He held his breath. And then, footsteps. Slow. Steady. They echoed through the silence. Closer. Closer. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat like a drum. He took a step back, but his foot found nothing but empty space. He had no choice but to stand still, listen, and wait. The footsteps stopped. The air grew colder still, biting, stinging at his exposed skin. It was too quiet. Too still. Then, the unmistakable sound of a soft, wet breath, right next to his ear. His blood ran cold. A whisper. I know you're there. He spun around, panic overtaking him, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark. The walls seemed to close in, the very air pressing against him, suffocating him. And then the figure appeared. In the corner of his vision. A flash of white, like a shadow flickering in and out of existence. It was just enough to make his stomach drop. He couldn't escape it. The darkness had him. Something moved in the corner again. Closer. He couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. For a split second, everything froze. The figure, there, right in front of him. Its face was just a blur at first. Then it became clear. A familiar face. One he knew. One he wished he hadn't. The face was twisted, eyes wide with terror. But there was no voice. No scream. Just that twisted, empty grin. And then, the train stopped. Completely. Still. Silent. The door behind him opened. A sliver of light spilled in. But he couldn't move. The train had stopped. And something else was waiting. The silence was unbearable, stretching out like a thick fog. He stood frozen, eyes locked on the figure before him, his breath shallow and erratic. The door, now wide open, beckoned with its slice of light. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the grinning face. The air around him was thick, suffocating. Each breath felt like he was inhaling ice. The figure stepped closer, its presence looming. It didn't make a sound, but the weight of its gaze was unbearable. It was like it was reaching into him, pulling at something deep inside. Something ancient, something forgotten. His chest tightened. The door. The light. He had to get through it. He took a tentative step forward, his legs shaky beneath him. But before he could move any farther, the figure's hand shot out. Cold fingers closed around his wrist, pulling him back. The grip was strong, unyielding, and he couldn't break free. The figure leaned in, its breath cold against his ear. A voice, not a whisper, but a growl. "You can't leave!" The words hung in the air like poison. His pulse raced. Panic surged through him. With every ounce of strength left in him, he twisted, pulling against the grip. His body screamed in protest. But then, a sharp pain. A pressure at his neck. He gasped, his vision blurring as the world seemed to tilt. The grip on his wrist loosened just enough. He yanked his arm free, stumbling toward the door. His hand touched the cold metal of the handle. He twisted it, flinging himself into the passage beyond. The darkness behind him felt like a living thing, reaching for him, pulling. He shoved the door open, falling out into the corridor. His chest heaved, and his legs shook beneath him. The lights above flickered, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. There was no sound now, just the soft hum of the train as it began to move again, slowly. He turned to run, but there was no escape. At the end of the corridor, another figure stood. Waiting. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, black and endless. The corridor stretched on, longer than he remembered. And it was closing in. The train lurched again. But this time, it didn't stop. It moved faster. And the shadows grew longer. The walls seemed to warp around him, narrowing with every step he took. His breathing was ragged, shallow, as though the very air was fighting against him. The figure at the end of the corridor didn't move. It just watched. Its eyes, dark, hollow, seemed to pierce through him, see into the depths of his soul. He couldn't turn back. There was no place to run. The train continued its maddening speed, faster now, shaking violently. Each twist and turn of the track sent his body jolting, slamming him against the walls. His heart pounded, echoing in his ears. The figure remained unmoving. It was closer now. It had to be. He couldn't bring himself to look away. But then, something shifted. The lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. Gone. Just like that. He exhaled, relief flooding him, but it was short-lived. The train was still speeding ahead, too fast now. He looked down, and his foot slid in something wet. The floor beneath him was slick, coated in something dark and sticky. He dared not look closer. But his mind was racing. The blood was everywhere. Everywhere. He turned back down the hallway, but the shadows seemed to follow him now. The once familiar train was transforming, warping into something else entirely. The doors, the windows, they all seemed to melt away. The walls were bleeding, pulsing with a sickly red glow. A sound, soft at first, began to hum in the distance. A low, rhythmic drone. It was like the heartbeat of the train. Or something else. He could feel it deep in his chest, the vibrations rattling his bones. The whispering came again, this time louder, clearer. "Come closer!" It was no longer a command, but a demand. He spun around, eyes wild, searching for the source. But it was everywhere. It was inside him. A sudden screech of metal against metal made him flinch. The train lurched again, this time uncontrollably, as if something had broken loose. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees, his hands sliding in the wetness that covered the floor. A flash of white. A figure. A pale face, too familiar, emerging from the shadows. Closer. Closer. He didn't want to look. He couldn't. But it was there. It was everywhere. The figure stepped into the light. And this time, he knew. He knew who it was. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own scream. And then the world went dark. Darkness consumed him. Cold. Absolute. He couldn't feel the floor beneath him anymore. There was no sound, no air. Just an overwhelming pressure, crushing him from all sides. And then, a flicker. A spark of light, weak and wavering, cutting through the dark like a knife. He gasped. The air felt thick, heavy, like he was suffocating. His hands scrabbled for something, anything to hold on to. He couldn't see. He couldn't move. The spark of light pulsed, growing larger, brighter. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was there. His mind screamed for him to run. To escape. But where? The walls of the train seemed to twist, closing in on him, shifting like liquid metal. A sound, the softest scrape of metal. His body froze. Something was moving in the dark. He felt it first, a cold breath against his neck, icy and damp. Then, a whisper. It's too late. The voice was familiar, but broken, distorted. It came from everywhere. From inside his head. He struggled to move, but his limbs were numb, paralyzed by the suffocating weight of the darkness. The light flickered again, sputtering, casting long, terrifying shadows across the walls. The figure emerged once more. Slow. Deliberate. It was different now, its face distorted, twisted, as if it had been reshaped by the darkness itself. The smile was gone. Replaced by something far worse. A hollow, gaping mouth. A mouth that opened wider, impossibly wide. Closer. Closer. It whispered again. Don't fight it. The train shuddered violently, throwing him forward. He slammed into the ground, pain exploding through his body, but he couldn't move. He was trapped. The walls of the train stretched and warped, as though the entire car had become part of the creature that lurked within. The whispering was louder now, deafening, crawling inside his mind. He couldn't take it. He couldn't escape it. And then, a sharp, piercing scream. It wasn't his. It was a sound of pure agony. A scream that seemed to go on forever. The figure stepped closer, its eyes now empty pits of blackness. The darkness was everywhere. He closed his eyes, unable to stop the trembling. The light flickered once more, and in the briefest moment of clarity, he saw something he never expected to see. A door. A way out. But as he reached for it, the walls shifted again. The train was no longer just a train. It was a living, breathing nightmare. And there was no escape. The door was just out of reach. His fingertips brushed against the cold metal, but it was as if the air itself was pulling him back. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, too heavy. The train's walls pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, as if the entire structure were alive, breathing, waiting. The blackness pressed against him, smothering every ounce of hope. He took one desperate step toward the door, but it slammed shut in front of him with a deafening screech. He recoiled, heart racing. The figure stood just beyond, its features now a blur of shadows. The darkness, thick and suffocating, wrapped around him tighter. He couldn't breathe. Every breath was a struggle against the weight of the air, the crushing presence that filled the train. The whispering came again, louder this time. Not a voice. No, it wasn't a voice. It was a feeling. An ancient, cold feeling, wrapping itself around his mind. Let go. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a command. It was an inevitability. He stumbled back, but his feet were stuck, trapped in the wet, sticky substance that had spread across the floor. He tried to pull his legs free, but they wouldn't budge. Something crawled beneath the surface of the floor. Small, unsettling movements. His eyes widened. He couldn't look. But the sound of skittering, like rats beneath the skin of the train. It grew louder. Closer. His heart was pounding, louder than the scratching, louder than the whispers. The figure took a step toward him. It was no longer humanoid. It was something far worse. A twisted shape, a mass of shifting limbs and shadows. It hovered, a black void, empty and hollow. Its eyes were gone. Its face was gone. Only that gaping, endless mouth remained. And it opened wider. Wider. Until it consumed everything. The train rattled, the noise deafening now, as if the entire car was shaking under some terrible weight. He wanted to scream, but the words were lost. The darkness was too complete, too consuming. The air thickened, and then a flash of blinding white. His body jerked, as if it was being pulled apart. The whisper grew louder, wrapping around his mind like chains. Welcome home. And then the world collapsed into nothing. The train, the darkness, the figure, everything vanished. He was weightless, falling, surrounded by silence. Endless silence. Then a light, faint, distant. He tried to reach for it, but the silence grew louder. Closer. Until it was all-consuming. And then nothing. The light was gone, swallowed whole by the vast, endless silence. He couldn't feel his body anymore. There was no floor beneath him. No walls. No train. Just emptiness. An expanse of nothingness that stretched out in every direction. He tried to move, but his limbs felt foreign, like they didn't belong to him anymore. The weightlessness was maddening, his mind spinning with disorientation. But then, a flicker. It wasn't light. It wasn't sound. It was a presence. A shadow. It came from somewhere deep within the void, stretching, looming. Slowly it took shape. The figure. Not the one from before. This one was something else. A silhouette against the abyss, its features obscured by a thick, impenetrable fog. It was not human. It didn't look human. It didn't need to. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, like distant stars trapped in the void. A voice echoed, but it wasn't a voice at all. It was a feeling, a vibration that hummed through his very being. You are mine now. The words pulsed through him, a cold wave that froze every thought, every emotion. He tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came. His mouth didn't move. He couldn't move. The figure stepped closer. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. He felt it, not in his body, but in his mind, in his soul. It was like the figure was everywhere at once, surrounding him, pressing in. Endless. The word hung in the void like a weight, hanging heavily in the air. He was trapped. He was lost. His breath quickened, panic surging through him. The figure reached forward, its hands stretching toward him, long, claw-like fingers extending. It was too close now. He could feel its coldness, a presence that was not meant to be. Escape is impossible. It whispered, not a voice, but a sensation. His mind screamed for him to run, to fight. But there was nowhere to go. He was caught in this endless darkness, bound by forces beyond his comprehension. The figure's hand brushed against him, a touch so cold it burned. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The world around him was nothing but empty space, and the figure, its eyes, its hand, were the only things left. He was not alone. He was never meant to be alone. The figure loomed closer, its presence growing, consuming him. And then, a sudden shift. The void cracked open. A single light. A flicker. But it was gone before he could reach it. And then, nothing. Complete and utter darkness. Forever. He was drifting again, lost in an ocean of pure blackness. Time had no meaning here. There was no past. No future. Only the oppressive weight of now. But then, a pulse. A faint glow, just on the edge of his perception. It flickered once, then again. Not light. Not warmth. Just an echo. A signal. A promise. He reached for it, instinctively. His fingers brushed something solid, but it wasn't right. It was cold. Too cold. Like ice. It felt like glass, smooth and unyielding. He tried to push against it, to break through, but it wouldn't give. It felt wrong. The pulse of light came again, but this time it was louder. Closer. A faint hum, like a distant song. A tune trapped in the darkness. It surrounded him, filled his mind, echoed through his very bones. The shadows receded. For a brief moment, he thought he could see. A crack in the void. A window into something else. But it shattered before he could reach it. And the darkness came flooding back. Something else moved in the dark. The air shifted, and with it, a low, gurgling sound filled the silence. It was in the distance. No, it was too close. He could hear the scrape of claws against stone, the soft rasp of something dragging across the floor. The figure from before. The one that had haunted him. It was still here. Still watching. Still waiting. His heart raced, the beating echoing in his head. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't breathe here. He couldn't. A sound. A shift. Something changed in the blackness. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in again, but there was no space, no walls here, only the empty void. Yet the pressure was real. He reached out, desperately seeking something, anything. His fingers scraped against the surface of something rough, something living. The presence was closer now. Closer than before. The air around him grew colder. Sharper. He could almost hear its breath. Soft. Wet. Drawing closer with every second. He pressed against the glass, the only thing he could touch, but it was too thin. Too fragile. And then, the whisper again. This time, it was clear. Your time is over. The words weren't comforting. They weren't a warning. They were an end. A finality. The pulse of light disappeared completely. And in the silence, the presence reached for him. A cold, skeletal hand. It wrapped around his throat. And everything went dark once more. Endlessly dark. A sharp gasp. The darkness shattered. Not all at once, but slowly. A faint light, warm and real, began to filter in, like dawn creeping through the cracks of night. He was still weightless, but no longer drowning in the void. He felt his body again, his legs, his hands, the air around him. He was alive. He could breathe. The blackness was still there, lurking in the corners of his mind, but it was fading. He felt the floor beneath him, solid, real. Cold stone, rough against his fingertips. He blinked. And then the world came into focus. He was no longer in the endless void. The train. He was back on the train. The same car. The same wooden walls. The faint hum of the train's movement soothed him for a moment, like a lullaby in the distance. But everything felt wrong. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. The air was thick again, suffocating. He stood up, swaying for a moment, his legs still unsteady as if he had been away for much longer than he thought. And then he saw it. The figure. It stood at the far end of the car. Silent. Still. Waiting. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It had substance now. Flesh. Eyes. Its mouth stretched into that same twisted grin. A smile that wasn't meant for this world. The train creaked as it moved. But it felt slower now, heavier, as if burdened by something dark. His breath caught in his throat. The figure stepped forward. Closer. It spoke, its voice like a hiss, a sound that scraped against the edges of his mind. You can't run from this. His pulse raced. His mind screamed at him to move, to escape. But his feet wouldn't obey. He couldn't move. It was too close now. The figure's presence was suffocating. The door. The exit. He had to get to it. But the figure was blocking the way. It was the same train. The same nightmare. Except this time, he knew. There was no escape. It wasn't just the train. It was him. The door stayed shut. And the figure's grin grew wider. And, just as the darkness had taken him before, it took him now. The figure was standing just inches away from him now, its hollow eyes locked onto his, pulling at his very soul. The room was spinning, the walls closing in tighter with each passing second. The train hummed like a distant heartbeat, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from another world entirely. He took a shaky step back, but his legs felt like lead. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, thicker, suffocating the light that barely clung to the room. The air was heavy, as though it were no longer just air but something dark and alive, pressing in on him from all sides. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its mouth stretched in that grotesque smile, its eyes, empty, endless, staring into him, through him. He tried to call out, but the words caught in his throat. Panic clawed at him, but it felt pointless. He had no voice here. No control. The figure's hand reached out, slow and deliberate, but the touch didn't come. Instead, a silence fell, deeper than any darkness he had known. For a moment, he couldn't remember why he was afraid. The figure, the train, the shadows, they all seemed to blur into one singular, unrecognizable presence. And then it hit him. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't just the train. This was his end. Everything had been leading to this moment. The whispers, the figure, the blood-stained floor, the whole journey had been a path to this inescapable fate. But as the figure's cold presence pressed against him, a sudden realization washed over him. He had been here before. Not in this train. Not in this body. But in another life. Another time. The figure, the train, the darkness, they weren't strangers. They were part of him. And with that thought, a strange peace settled over him. The figure's smile faded, as though it had been waiting for him to understand. And as the train sped forward, the last thing he saw was the soft glimmer of light at the very end of the tracks. He closed his eyes. And let go. In the silence, the train continued on, its journey never ending.